Rami, Rami and Lara for helping to put this together. And thank you all for joining us this evening. It's really hard for me to speak about Shireen in the past tense. I even still find it hard to get over the whole thing, her assassination and her loss. Of course, Shireen is not the first or the last targeted by the Israeli and killed by the Israeli army. Yesterday, Ghufran, another journalist, while going to her work, was targeted and killed. Besides 4 others, five five killed in 24 hour. And however, it feels a little bit different, and the grief and pain is deeper. You know the person personally, and when the person is your close friend. You know, I never imagined to lose my close friend. It's too soon, I thought. However, under the grave reality of colonization, everything is possible. I've known Shireen since 2004 through a friend, Iman Hamouri, and we became close. Um, Shireen is amicable, not confrontational, fun to be with, always finding reasonable and sensible solutions to problems. We even used to tell her, you are our diplomatic friend. My conversations with Shireen were mixture of social, personal, and more serious stuff. Jokes also, she has a great sense of humor, by the way. Last time I spoke to her was one day before her assassination, and we spoke for about half an hour. She told me about how she is paying attention to her diet now, and that she was back to exercising. We also discussed the latest EU report that accuses Palestinian textbooks of incitement to violence and anti-Semitism. She told me that this is a very important issue that I'd like to cover. However, I'm too busy with Jenin. That's what she said. So she was not ready to die, I would say. I mean, she was planning ahead. She was also an unusual and distinguished journalist because she viewed her profession as a way to convey the Palestinian narrative and Palestinian suffering to the whole world. I mean, she did not only report under the colonial rule, but also under divided politics, as you know, the division between Fatah and Hamas. However, she was very careful. This was not her focus. She focused on the colonial policies. That was her mission in life. She has witnessed a great deal behind the scenes, I would say. I mean, she was subject to the same treatment as the Palestinians she covered, but she never posted about that, or she never mentioned that. She used to tell me stories. Like last year, she told me how she was trying to get rid of the skunk water in her hair because protesters, including also her as a reporter, were sprayed with the skunk water. So, but that was not her focus. It was never her reports were about her. The reports were about events. I remember once I showed one of her reports on Palestinian children going to school in Hebron, and I showed it to our MA students. Although the report is in Arabic, they understood what was going on. To that extent, she is good in reporting. I never heard anyone criticize her report because she was very careful. She has done her homework beforehand. She always studied what she was going to report. I mean, she was really popular. I remember when we were having coffee in Ramallah, several times a teenage girl would come to her and say, "You are my role model and inspiration." Shireen is also well read. I mean, we used to suggest books to each other and discuss them. It's really ironic that the last book we discussed was Rise and Kill First by Ronan Bergman, and it was about the Israelis' targeted assassination policies. It's also ironic that we agreed that these policies and the capability of Israel is exaggerated in that book to scare Palestinians. Going through our messages, I also remember that we discussed an article in Haaretz about a sniper admitting to hit 42 knees of the Palestinian protesters in Gaza. I found this really ironic. Earlier this year, she mentioned to me an interview that she interviewed Essam Khalidi, who is an expert in the Palestinian football from the mandate onward. And I found an academic article by him, and I added it to our students and to my modules. Shireen also worked on herself professionally to keep up to date. We learned Hebrew language together, separately, but the same teacher, Fayrouz from the Nazareth. And at the beginning, we used to compete in doing the homework. And Shireen was very good. She advanced really well. So I used to tease her and tell her, I think you cheat. And she would go, no, I think you don't work hard enough. That's why. And she was right. I mean, and her teacher, Fayrouz, also thought that she was hardworking and very dedicated, and that she advanced a lot in a short time. Shireen is also a loving and caring person. She has other close friends. She always wanted to make sure to get in touch with them, like Aline and Rula from childhood and the university. She always told me about them and how she made sure that she wanted to have time for them. She has a loving family as well, Tony, Lisa, Lina is here with us, Nasri. So I've met the family and they're really wonderful. All of that, you can imagine why people mourned her as a member of their family. All of that also shows you how she became a symbol of unity for Palestinians. All of that shows you that she became also a symbol of resistance. And all of that shows you why Israel attacked her from a funeral, because Israel hates Palestinians, to see Palestinians united. I think Lina later will tell you about such attacks and efforts from the Israeli army and Israeli police to stop people from mourning Shireen. Finally, I really miss Shireen, and I think my life will not be the same without her. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Nadia, a lot. We also have Professor Ilan Pape that joined us. He will also be our guest speaker. I will now leave the floor to Lina Abu Akle. Please, you have the floor. Thank
you. Thank you for having me, and thank you everyone for being here and taking the time to listen to us. As Nadia said, it's so difficult to even put into words what I have been feeling, what my family has been feeling, and all our close friends and the entire nation. It was only a few days before her assassination that we were spending time together. Every Sunday, Shireen and our family, we always have our Sunday family lunches. And on Sunday, we spent it in Ramallah, in Snowbar. She said, the weather is nice. Let's take Filfel, her dog. We'll go and just have our Sunday family lunch there. It was just a regular Sunday, just another day where we spent together. And it's funny because even while we were having lunch, I saw she had her phone on the side of the table, and she was watching the news. She had Al Jazeera turned on, and at that moment she was a bit worried that something might happen in Jenin, and she might have to go back to Jenin because she was there a few days before that. Growing up, I mean, like, Shireen has been someone I've been looking up to since I was a kid. She wasn't just my aunt, she was my second mom, she was my godmother, she was my best friend. And I've always wanted to be a reporter. I always wanted to be a journalist. I would steal all her notes, and I would just pretend that I know how to read in Arabic, because at that time I still was a kid. And I always wanted to I would take up the phone and pretend. I would take the phone and pretend that I'm also reporting and sit on a little table. So I always wanted to be like Shireen growing up, and it's beyond. It's so difficult to put into words what I've been feeling and what everyone has been feeling. And I didn't think I would actually get this emotional, but the day where she was assassinated, my father called me. He was out of town, and he told me that Shireen has been injured. Call her and make sure she's okay. I picked up the phone. I started calling her. She wouldn't reply. She wouldn't answer. And few minutes after that, her friend told me that her colleague told me we're trying to get her out of Jenin to another hospital. But I was so scared. It's these 5 minutes were the hardest moments of my entire life. I don't think it will ever get worse than that. Hearing her colleague tell me that Shireen has been martyred it will be forever etched in my brain. I will never forget her voice, forget the words. I don't think I've ever imagined to see this day. I was always so worried for my aunt. I would always tell her, be careful. If you cannot go, if there's something risky, try your best to avoid it. And she would always reassure me, telling me, Lena, we're journalists, we're wearing our vests, we have our helmets, everything is bulletproof. But I just never thought that it would actually happen. I never thought that in that moment I would lose my aunt. I never thought that I would have to ever hear those words. And again, this is all part of Israel's targeted assassination, targeted killing. And it was very clear that Shireen was targeted. She was the voice of Palestine. She was the voice of truth. She always had a unique way of putting everything that's been happening in Palestine and spreading it out to the world to see. She was good at uncovering the crimes of Israel, and that's why they feared her. So fast forward to the day of, not even few hours into the day, we received a phone. The Israeli occupation police, they came to our house and they started telling us how to mourn Shireen. They told us there will be no gatherings outside the house, there will be no chants, and you need to limit the number of people showing up. Of course, we did not let that happen. We did not let them dictate how we will mourn our Shireen. And even after that, the day of the funeral, my father was summoned to the police station. They asked him again, how many people will be attending the funeral? What's the scheduled plan for the funeral procession? They told him that you're not allowed to have more than 500 people mourning. And my father told them, I do not get to tell people not to come and pay their condolences and their respects. On the contrary, this is not just a funeral for our family and friends. This is a funeral for the entire nation. Everybody will be mourning Shireen, because Shireen, as everyone was saying, wasn't just our daughter. She wasn't just my aunt. She was the daughter of Palestine, and everyone wanted to mourn her. So the day of the funeral, Obviously, my father did not agree to any of their demands, even though they said otherwise later in the media that my father had agreed. That's not true. The day of the funeral, again, they came to our house early morning. They were trying to make sure everything is under control, even though there were no issues. We told them simply, if you do not cause any trouble, if you do not engage or attack, there will be no issues. The day of the funeral, we made our way to the hospital. On the way, there were so many police cars. There were even checkpoints on the way, making sure that we are the family, limiting the number of people entering the hospital. We got to the hospital. They removed her from the fridge, and everyone was carrying her they were carrying her coffin on their shoulders. On our way to the hearse, we were greeted by the Israeli occupation forces, fully armed, and they immediately started attacking left and right. They even I was in the front line. They told me, if you don't get out of the way, we will beat you. And he threatened me with the baton. And after that, they started throwing stun grenades. I made my way into the hospital to find shelter. And it was very scary. I actually was very afraid, not just for me, but I was afraid that they might confiscate her coffin, because this has happened in the past. Later, as the entire world saw the way they were attacking the pallbearers, they were trying their best to make the casket fall. And I give all my thanks and my respect to the pallbearers who were resilient, and they were able to still continue holding her, even though she almost fell. And after that, they also went ahead and they broke the windows of the hearse. Her casket arrived to the church covered in glass. I couldn't even put my hand at some point because it was just shattered glass everywhere. Even making our way to the church was humiliating. The entire thing, what they did, not just to the entire funeral, but what they did to the hospital, at the hospital, was they violated her right to dignity. They violated our right to a funeral, and they also violated the sanctity of the hospital. My father, he was late to the funeral for the church service for around 30 minutes, 40 minutes, because they wouldn't let him inside. There were so many people who were not allowed to enter the church. And also they were questioning people's religious beliefs, if they are Christian or Muslim, which is ridiculous to say the least. So the entire experience, as phenomenal as her funeral was, and it was the longest funeral in the history of modern Palestine, and something I pride myself with. But it further uncovered the crimes that Israel continues to commit. They didn't just kill Shireen once in Jenin. They also killed her again at her funeral, when they were attacking the mourners, when they were attacking the hearse, when they were not allowing people to mourn her respectfully. And this goes on to show that Israel commits these crimes, and it continues to get away with them due to lack of accountability. It's never held responsible. No one ever, people just go on to condemn, but there's no concrete action to actually hold Israel accountable. And even only a few days ago, during the flag march in Jerusalem, we saw videos of Israeli Jewish settlers who were chanting and celebrating the death of Shireen. They were mocking her, they were dancing. And that goes on to show that this is a result of Israel's state-sanctioned violence against Palestinians. It continues to show that Israel no longer fears cameras. Everything is recorded everything. We have evidence for everything, but due to lack of accountability, this continues to happen. And Shireen, as Nadia said, is not going to be the last martyr. There are so many others. I mean, only today there were multiple martyrs in the West Bank. I'm just, all that I have to say is that the entire experience, this entire thing could have been avoided if it wasn't for the international community's lack of accountability towards Israel. And the investigation clearly showed how Shireen was targeted in her the above part of her body. And I even was present in Jenin. I was able to visit the crime scene. It was very emotional. It was very tough, but I did want to see, I did want to be there and see where it all happened. And last but not least, I just want to say that Shireen was the best aunt that I could have ever asked for. I always told her that she was the best journalist, and I will always say that she was the best aunt, she was the best journalist, she was the best friend that I would ever have. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Lina. Thank you a lot. I would now give the floor to Professor Ilan Pape. Please keep your. I would kindly ask you to keep your mics closed, please. Yeah, and I want to pass to leave the floor to Professor Ilan Pape. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Francesco, and thank you to everyone who organized that very important event. It's very difficult to continue, as we heard from two people who were very close to Shireen, and one can only add our own condolences and support as much as we can to Shireen's family and close friends in this terrible moment. As was mentioned, in the last 24 hours, Israel killed 4 Palestinians in the West Bank. The victim was a boy, Mahmoud Oda Mahmoud, who was assassinated by the Israeli soldiers west of Ramallah. And this is an addition to a daily killing that started around the 1st of April this year, mainly of young men and children, but as we also know, of Shireen and the wounding of another journalist. Every every Palestinian who was killed actually deserves a webinar. One of the things that the Israelis managed to do in their domestic consumption was to talk about numbers without names of the people they killed, calling them terrorists. In 90% of the case, these are people that they killed without any proof or any act of violence. And one of the most important thing we have to do is to humanize these victims of the Israeli assassination policies and know as much as we can about these young men, sometimes boys, women, and women who are on a daily basis are now killed because, as Lynn said, Israel feels that it can go on without any danger of being internationally rebuked or suffering from a regime of sanctions or any other reaction by the international community. And therefore, unfortunately, this will continue unless there is a strong international intervention. I want to expand a little bit the historical context of these Israeli killings, and especially the assassination of Shireen as a journalist, and to say that the Israelis and before that the Zionist movement were always afraid of people among the native local indigenous Palestinian society who were able to articulate well, either in Arabic or English, the injustice that Zionism caused in Palestine. And it was very clear that any articulated and well-argued Palestinian position that challenged the Zionist claim that Palestine belonged to the Zionist movement, and later on other Israeli claims that the Palestinians were having a national movement, was actually a terrorist movement. All these Israeli claims that were part of the Israeli propaganda meant to justify the basic policy of ethnic cleansing of dispossession that the Zionist leader argued for from the very beginning of the Zionist project in Palestine, and which is still the basic Israeli strategy in 2022. All these arguments and all these fabrications were challenged successfully and brilliantly, generation after generation, by Palestinian intellectuals, poets, academics, and political activists. And Zionism already in 1946, when for the first time, it took time for the Palestinian national movement to understand what was about to happen when British would leave Palestine. So in 1946, the Zionist leadership already prepared a program called Plan G, Plan Gimel in Hebrew, which had a list of Palestinian journalists, poets, writers, intellectuals that were particularly, in the eyes of the Israeli, vociferous in their articulation of the Palestinian right to Palestine and objection to the colonization of Palestine. So in a similar way, in the early 1970s, where after the Fatah movement took over the PLO and began to be established more institutionally in the south of Lebanon, and with it brought also cultural institutions, journals, and not only the Fatah, also the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the Popular Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, where the Palestinian Liberation Movement, on all its branches, began to produce knowledge, either through commentary on current affairs or research on history. Israel began a campaign of assassination. One of the most famous victims of that campaign of assassination, in fact, commemorated his death just a week and a half ago, and this was Ras Nafani, the editor of Al-Hadaf and the great Palestinian poet. 2 years after the assassination of Ras Kanafani, the Israeli military assassinated a number of leading Palestinian intellectuals, journalists, and academics as part of an attempt to destroy the cultural elite of the Palestinians that not threaten Israel with military force. But, the Israelis thought that sometimes the word was mightier than the Palestinian sword. And we've seen that with the introduction of modern media into our life, first in the first Intifada, Israel was targeting a journalist that in the first Intifada was still trying to hide some of the criminal policies and targeted not only Palestinian journalists, but also foreign journalists. It is absolutely true that in the Second Intifada, they felt so secure in their international immunity that they stopped even attacking journalists, and they allowed them to pictures or film what was going on. But on the other hand, they started to target the Palestinian society. They began to produce alternative media. You're all familiar with the list of 6 NGO organizations that Israel demanded that would recognize the United States terrorist organization. What is common to all these 6 organizations, they constantly produce accurate and comprehensive knowledge on the Israeli crimes. And Al Jazeera as a network and Shin as its important representative on the ground exactly brought the complete picture that Israel is realized it cannot totally control anymore. And there is great sense in Israel that these kind of images, these kinds of reports, this kind of accurate representation of the reality ridicules the Israeli propaganda machine in this age of internet and satellite TV. And therefore, they are trying to limit the coverage once again and to make sure that they can control the representation of the reality on the ground. And of course, we have enough images every day that shows that in this battle of narrative, or as the very successful Palestinian website calls it, the electronic intifada, this will go on without the Israelis being able to control it. But because they are unable to control it, I think their frustration leads to more a personal attack and direct attack on activists and journalists. They don't like the message and they would like to kill the messenger. We should not forget how many journalists they killed and wounded during the Great March next to the Gaza fence in 2018. Again, you would ask yourself, why do they need to kill the journalists if they are so powerful and they could shoot anyone they wanted there? It's really the arrogance of the colonizer that they could do not only control and dispossess, they also want the land and the people. They also want to control the narrative, the story. The only thing you can hope for is that the frustration that they have of not being able to stop the information flowing from Palestine into the rest of the world, the only hope we have is that the brutal attempt to stop it will wake up more people than ever before, will increase the support that already exists to the Palestinian struggle for liberation in the civil society, and hopefully that huge support and solidarity shown all over the world, in all over the global civil society, would finally begin to influence policies from above of governments who until now, either because of intimidation or timidity, refuse to take action. And we've seen how the coverage of what goes on in the Ukraine is exactly an example of what the international community does not allow us to have Palestine. Hypocrisy in this case is coming out. And I don't think we should forget this when we are watching whatever we think of what goes on in the Ukraine. We should think about the double standard that the Western media and politicians are showing when you compare the two cases of occupation resistance and understand why, what kind of a coalition of cowards, hypocrites, and Islamophobic racist people they are facing in the world that produce and provide a shield of immunity to Israel. But of course, Shireen was not alone and will not be alone in this struggle that will make sure that this shield is penetrated and that people with a modicum of decency in them would be able to know exactly what Israel is doing now, what it had been doing in the past, and would not remain indifferent in the face of this inhumanity and criminal policies that influence not only the reality in Palestine, but in the Arab world and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you deeply, Ilan, for your intervention. Now the floor is open for questions. I don't see any now. So I don't know, I would like to ask our speakers if there's something they want to add while we wait for other questions. Otherwise, we have also just one question and one interesting consideration that we received by email. So otherwise I can start by them. But let me know if Nadia, Lina, Ilan, there's something you want to add, or we can start with the Q&A.
If there's a question, I suggest we'll hear.
Okay, I think we lost Ilan, but
Yeah, Kevin has.
Yeah, Kevin has a question in the meantime. So, I mean, I would be more inclined towards like having written questions because we are a lot. But if we can keep it polite this way, I don't know, Kevin. If you want to, we try. If it doesn't work, we will go with written questions. So, thank you, Kevin. You're muted. Yeah. Okay.
Hello. Hi.
Yeah.
Hi. That was very interesting. We lost a little bit with the audio, but that might be from my end. I'm not sure. There was a hint of optimism in there about the what I suppose is a slow and organic process of the propaganda being met with perhaps a growing realization of what is really going on. And I'm just wondering if Ilan really could tell us if the optimism that was implicit at the end of his talk a bit is due to any more than optimism. What are the signs?
Okay.
Yes.
That could be
Will
for
I
anybody.
take it, Francesco?
Sure, Ilan. Go.
Yeah. Thank you, Kevin. No, this is not a baseless optimism. It's based on certain intervention in the conversation on Palestine that I would not have believed I would see them 10 or 15 years ago. I will give you 2 examples.
Good.
To show you how this information that brave journalists like Shireen made sure that the world would know has influenced important sections in the global community that until recently would not have dared to use the appropriate language to describe what was going on in Palestine. A very important example is Amnesty's international report on Israel as an apartheid state. Even if people in Amnesty International thought that Israel was an apartheid state already 20 or 30 years ago, and they did think that way, I know, they didn't dare to publish a report. The fact that they believe that this is now the time to, if you want to be bold and even risk because Israel will do all it can now to delegitimize Amnesty International professionalism. The fact that they are bold enough to do it is one indication. A similar indication are various academic societies in the United States of scholars who know very well what goes on because they analyze it as part of their profession, and they are not anymore content with publishing their findings, but they are asking for action on the basis of their finding. In their cases, because they're academic communities, they called for academic boycott on Israel. So scholars are being active as they were at the time of apartheid South Africa. Now, here and there, even in mainstream media such as the New York Times in New York, mainstream newspapers in various parts of Europe, we are beginning, and the indication is always language, we're beginning to see a better understanding of who is the colonizer and who's the colonized, who is the victim and who is the victimizer. I don't want to exaggerate. The mainstream media, mainstream politics are still, as I said, either afraid or are seduced, I don't know, by Israel and do not take any meaningful stance against Israel. But more and more, their important sections in their societies do not remain indifferent.
Yeah.
This is optimism about change of attitude from the outside. I'm fully aware. I don't know why I closed my camera. Sorry, something is wrong with my camera. But anyway, I'm fully aware that this does not mean, as I say, change on the ground cannot come from actions of the civil society alone. It has to come from policies from above.
Good. Good. Thank you.
Can I just add that another indication is the Palestinian ongoing resistance, as you have seen. I mean, every generation is even more courageous than the generation before. And probably you've seen the strong resistance in Jerusalem lately by the youngsters. So that's another indication that gives hope also that things will change.
Inshallah.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Kevin, and thank you so much for the answers. We're starting to have quite some questions. So I will start with the question from David Ojakian. I hope I pronounced it correctly. I'm sorry. That asks a very simple question, but important one. He's asking, what can be done to hold Israel accountable for their crimes? I guess we can start from this one. So whoever wants to answer, please.
Lina, are you with us?
Yes, I can answer that.
Yeah, I would like Lina to, because tell them.
So as a start, this is something we believe that the US has an influence, a major influence. So what we can say is that we can call on Biden's administration to pressure Israel to actually hold those responsible and who set the policies accountable. Because at the end of the day, we're not going to accept just an Israeli investigation, because you cannot be the murderer and also the investigator at the same time. It doesn't work like that. And also, as per the request of the Congress, to investigate the crimes committed targeting American citizens. So, as I said earlier, we need to move past just condemnation and actually start with treating Israel the same way that Russia has been treated. The double standard is very clear, and it's out there and everyone can see, and we were just talking about it. So, and another thing is that anyone who actually believes in the freedom of press, freedom of speech, and justice will actually help us to hold Israel accountable. And that should also start with the participation of civil societies, activists. We did see a good amount of reaction to Shirin's assassination, but this is not a separate incident. This is part and parcel of the entire occupation, the entire apartheid system, and it's a part of a long-standing Israeli policy of systematically humiliating and brutalizing the entire people. So when action needs to be taken, it's not just by one body. It has to be the international community, and starting with the US. The US provides Israel with $3.8 billion every year. I'm pretty sure that it has the power to actually do something to hold Israel accountable for its crimes. And just to add another thing, as everyone knows now that there have been the investigation, the case has been submitted to the ICC. Another thing can be is that for the ICC to actually expedite the investigation and hold those responsible accountable. From the very early onset of the war on Ukraine, the ICC had started an investigation. The same can be done towards Israel if there is pressure and if people continue to call for an end into the occupation, to the apartheid, and call it for what it is, an apartheid system.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lina, for the clarity. And we have a question, another one that kind of relates to what Lina was just saying, from another Lina Rodriguez this time. She's asking basically two questions, but very connected to the answer you gave, Lina. She's asking, considering Israeli influence, can we trust that Shireen will have the justice she deserves? So in part, this was answered. And she also asks, recently, a Russian soldier was punished for the murder of a Ukrainian journalist. So can we expect the same for the Israeli soldier who killed Shireen? So, I mean, we have partly answered and partly it's connected to what we were just saying, but if someone wants to jump in on this, please.
Well, again, as I mentioned earlier, with regards to the investigation, I mean, there's still some ambiguity around the topic. And as I said, we keep hearing statements about a transparent investigation. And the US continues to say that they do support an investigation, but we still haven't seen anything in action. We still haven't seen any concrete steps being taken. But we as a family, we're being hopeful. We're hoping that this would be a change and an investigation would actually set a precedent. As I said, there's clearly double standards. So we're hoping, and I know Shireen was a very optimistic person. And I used to always ask her, like, what do you think is going to happen eventually? And she would always say, there's going to be a day where the occupation is going to end. So I'm trying to take in from her optimism and say that, yes, there will be justice, even if that's going to take a while, but we are hopeful that justice will prevail and there will be accountability. There has to be, there has to be something done. And we're hoping that there will be cooperation from all different, from the international community and the US. I hope that answered the question.
Thank you, Lina, so much. On the same line on future prospects and potential solutions, we have a question from Shada Aziz for Professor Pape, which says, in your book on Palestine, you have discussed different approaches towards a solution to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Do you believe that the current escalations, what you have discussed earlier in the book with Noam Chomsky, is still valid?
Yes, the book was written quite a while ago, but unfortunately, in Palestine, what we have is a process which its basic characteristics do not change. They just become more intense and escalate. So when we talked about a process by which the Judaization of the West Bank made it impossible to talk seriously about a two-state solution about 5 or 6, 7 years ago, this particularly process has intensified since we had this conversation. So if this was an important feature of the discussion of one state or two states, for instance, it is even more obvious today than it was when we wrote the book. Similarly, when we discussed the fact that the Israeli Jewish society is moving rapidly to institutionalize its apartheid regime, as we saw it so many years ago, I think nowadays we can say that most of these processes have matured and they have now become a fact of life. So I think that the basic ideas, at least that I put forward, I'm not sure my co-author agreed with everything I said, but the basic ideas I put forward that there's already a one state that controls the whole of Palestine through policies of oppression, apartheid, siege, ethnic cleansing, is valid today as it was valid then, that the Palestinian liberation movement will find eventually a way of dealing with this new reality, hopefully through unity and representation, and that the international community would have to adopt a language and an approach which is relevant to what goes on. So any conversation about the peace process is ridiculous. Any conversation about the conflict is ridiculous. There is no conflict and there's no peace process. There is a colonialist project that is still going on. And what you need is not a peace process, but decolonization and change of regime. And all these issues are become clearer by the day. So I don't think we have much to add in sense of what should be the vision for the future. We are all struggling, as we should struggle, how to get there. And this is something the Palestinians themselves would have to lead us into that direction, and would do it as part of the liberation project that we will all support, whether we are Jewish citizens of Israel like myself, or whether we support that struggle from the outside as people who believe in humanity and human rights and civil rights for everyone.
Thank you again, Ilan. Okay, we have Musna Shahabi. She says she's having a question. So Musna, either you want to write it down or you want to just address it directly. Just feel free. Okay, so if you can speak, please do it.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah, it's clear. We can hear you very well.
Okay, hi. Thank you very much for this webinar. Very much needed. Shireen was also a close friend of mine, and it's a very difficult time for all of us, and it won't get better. I really appreciate all what's being said, and I think that I agree totally with Ilan, and but at the same time, I don't see things happening in this direction. When you have the Palestinian Authority still talking about peace process, about two-state solution, when you don't have a unified leadership, I mean, there is two battles. More, it's not even just fighting the occupation and colonialism. And I am Palestinian, I live in France, and frankly, this kind of webinar with teachers from universities like yourself and Nadia can never happen in France. They cannot talk even about BDS. They cannot, I mean, it just feels so depressing to be away from home and to have your friend assassinated, and at the same time be in an environment where you don't have the chance to do anything, and it's even illegal to call for boycott. So the battle is huge, and I think Palestinians abroad in the diaspora need to do something. at least for them to unify, because, you know, internally it's difficult. And as long as there is, you know, the Oslo Accord, somehow it's still there, with the Palestinian Authority still speaking about we want peace and we want negotiations. So what would you do as a Palestinian in the diaspora, and you see all these, you know, things that are completely scattered everywhere and you don't know where to start? Thank you.
Thank you. It's open. Whoever wants to address it, please, to answer.
I mean, we are also abroad trying. Of course, we contribute to the struggle. Mind you that the Palestinian resistance in the past was based in the diaspora. Everybody, I think, has a role. But of course, the inside is, I would say, from my experience, from being there, from being an activist in the first Intifada, from being an activist outside and inside, I think inside is more effective, of course. But also the Palestinian diaspora alliances, our brothers and sisters in the struggle, comrades in the struggle, all of this adds up. And we all have each one of us has a role. I don't blame you, Muzna, that you are a bit pessimistic about what is going on. But at the same time, if you look at what is going on, what Ilan talked about, for example, Human Rights Watch report, what I said about the Palestinians who are struggling inside, like in Jerusalem, should give you a glimpse of hope. So I don't think we should give up. We should keep going on and on, contributing, even if it's a small step, it will add up. But I understand how you feel. We all feel this sometimes, you know. I mean, I remember once I was talking to Shireen, and she started to tell me about the situation and how bad is it, and so on. And I said to her, you know what? I regret I called you. You depressed me. And she said, where shall I get you good news from Palestine? That's the situation, you know. So, I mean, we get into this sometimes, but I'm sure, Muzna, that sometimes you feel, wow, something is going on, something is adding up, something is good is going on. But in general, yes, there is an issue with the international community. There is an issue with some Arab states, but we have alliances. We have activists who support us and who help us and willing to do everything for us. I don't know if Ilan wants to add, or Lina.
All that I just wanted to add was that I think what we saw during Shireen's funeral, that within itself kind of gave me hope as to how everyone was united. She united everyone, regardless of political factions, religious background. Everyone was united, and that to me is a little bit a step, I would say. And we're trying to believe that there is a bright side to what happened, even though it's tragic. But she did unite everyone, and no one has ever witnessed what happened at her funeral before. So hopefully that's something to look forward to, that something good is going to come out.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lina. We have just a couple of considerations / questions by Ali Mallah. He's asking, first of all, to Professor Ilan, if to him it would be any kind of added value to have a public debate, for example, with someone that is actively campaigning against BDS, such as the UK Home Secretary Patel. And this is one question. Yeah, and that's it mainly from from Ali. So I would leave the floor to Ilan for this question.
I'm sure I'm willing to debate Patel. I don't think she will. Um, but I really think yes, and I believe, I think you're right, Ali. I think a public debate where one can answer one-to-one the allegations that are connected to BDS is important, no doubt about it. But it's very interesting. The supporters of Israel and France is a very good example, and few states in the United States are a good example. And our here in Britain, the Home Secretary is a good example. If you notice, they don't put an arrangement of answers or criticism on BDS. They're using force in order to try and stop BDS, legislation, intimidation, because there is no counter argument for the BDS. At first, they thought that they had some counter argument, but it's BDS started in 2005, and the situation has become so bad since 2005 that they know that a lot of people who are enraged by what's going on in Palestine would like the governments to do something, and since the governments are not doing something, they're using the main weapon that civil society has, which is boycott, which is saying to a certain state that there is a price tag attached to your criminal policies. So we don't have any more debates with the people who defend Israel's policy. What we have is an attempt to silence us, is an attempt to intimidate us, because there is a genuine and justified fear by Israel and its supporters that if people would hear us, they will know exactly on which side they want to be. As a good friend of mine once said, when it comes to the truth, the Palestinians have very little to lose. And I think that is something that worries Israel, and it really connects to what we talked about before, that people who are particularly good at articulating that truth on the Palestinian side were targeted by Israel. They were not debated with, but they were targeted. Israel uses force, not moral arguments, to counter BDS, and the same is true about Israel supporters such as the Home Secretary and many, unfortunately, quite a few senior politicians in the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Ilan, so much. I don't see any questions in the chat, but I mean, we still have 15 minutes, so if you want to ask something, please go on. In the meantime, while we wait for the last questions, I guess, the one small consideration, something I would like to ask to the speakers. I think, I mean, with the 2 years experience I have here in Jerusalem now, a powerful thing, and I think that the first powerful legacy that Shireen left us was the fact that during her funeral, when people were mourning her, for a few hours, effectively, Palestinians took back control of a part of the old city in some way, being together, being united, fighting all as one. And finally, we saw the magic of Palestinian flags getting inside Jaffa Gate. And I thought about what happened 1 year before, during May, again with the uprising that was present everywhere, from 48 Palestine to the West Bank, to Gaza, to Jerusalem, of course. And I was thinking if what happened, apart from being a powerful legacy from Shireen, can tell us about a new kind of trend, a new generation of young Palestinians that are aware, that are ready to unite in the struggle and change the paradigm. So this is a question. There are just a few others, but I will leave you with this. Thank you.
So can you state the question again, Frank?
Yeah, if I was asking if we are kind of seeing a new trend.
I see.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I see. Actually, you reminded me of something Shireen told me when she visited the grandfather of one of the attackers, of Tel Aviv attackers, a young man, I think he's 20, who's in jail right now. She told me that she sat with his grandfather, who said to her that his grandson, he never noticed anything on his grandson. He was looking forward to his education, and he was planning ahead and so on. What really, probably that's the analysis of the grandfather, what triggered what he did, the attack in Tel Aviv, was what he saw in Al-Aqsa Mosque, the attacks, the constant attacks on Al-Aqsa Mosque. He said to her that most these youngsters were very angry and upset to see these attacks and are unable to do anything. So they wanted to defend it. They wanted to defend their cause. He also added to her that if you see these young men and women, they are always surrounded with checkpoints. They can't travel from one place to another. I mean, they live a miserable reality. That's the analysis of the grandfather. So wherever there is oppression, there will be resistance, of course. And from people we do not expect from. I mean, even the grandfather and the father of this man were surprised and shocked at what he did. They couldn't believe it. Many of them, actually. But that's what the grandfather told Shireen, and I think it explains how this resistance will continue. I mean, Israel can put an end to this bloodshed by dismantling the colonial structure, by stopping building settlements, by not allowing settlers leash those attacks on people. I mean, today I saw on Facebook, somebody wrote on Facebook, we are very close to have settlers attack us inside our homes now. I don't know if Ilan wants to add something to this, or Lina. Where is everybody gone?
It's all here. I mean, if nobody wants to add anything, we have other questions, by the way. Maybe I shall just collect the last two so that then we can go.
Oh, there are more questions?
Yeah, there are two more questions. Maybe we can say they're the last ones and then we can wrap up. What do you say? Okay. So we have the first one from Sabiha Alushi for Nadia and Lina. She's asking, she's saying, without belittling the fact that many women across the Arab world are significantly marginalized, Shireen embodied a notoriously strong Arab woman. What legacy do you think Shireen is going to leave behind in our region and elsewhere? This is one question. And then we have another question from Aya. I'm sorry, there's only the name. She would like to know where to start to correct the false thinking that usually people have on Palestine. And this is a question for all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sabiha, for the question. Yes, of course. I mean, I think Shireen, even before her assassination, but this was strengthened by her assassination. Even before, as I said, many times when we were having coffee in Ramallah, teenage girls would come and say, you are our role model. And she inspired many women, many girls, that they can do this. I mean, I think Shireen broke so many taboos. I mean, she was always in the field. She was covering, and I know that Shireen used to go to places in the middle of nowhere to be with people and cover their stories. There's one thing I would like also to add about Shireen's style of reporting, because she's passionate about the cause, and because she felt that this is her cause. It's not that I am a journalist covering only. Actually, last month, I remember when we were talking, she said to me, Nadia, do you remember Humsa, Khirbet Humsa, that was threatened to be destroyed? It has been destroyed. No Humsa anymore. This is what I like about Shireen, that she follows up. And this what inspired many people, be it men or women. But because she is a woman that showed this, that she was courageous, and she was she wasn't intimidated by the Israeli army during her coverage. I'm sure that you all have seen her while the soldiers and the police pushing her, she was reporting. And I told her once, how could you do it? How could you find the words to keep talking and talking while they were pushing her? So yes, I think this is her legacy, and it will live on, and it will be an inspiration for many, I am hoping.
Yeah, and just to add to that, she had a very unique way of reporting, and she always knew how to maintain a level of professionalism. And as you said, even while being harassed or while being pushed away, she would still stay calm, and she would still continue to report, and she would do it in such a professional and a manner that I've never seen in other reports. And another thing to talk about is that, as Nadia mentioned, that she broke a lot of norms, a lot of gender norms in a society, especially in Palestine. She would also be out late reporting, and she was doing what she loved because she was dedicated, not just to her job, but she was dedicated to uncovering the crimes of Israel and to show what the Palestinians have to say, and to actually give voice to those who were silenced. So she had to go out of her way. She had to make sure that she was covering every angle and every story there is to cover in Palestine. So yeah, I was probably her #1 fan ever since I was a kid, and she was always inspiring me, and until today. And she was just doing her job. And another important point that I want to say is that she was very humble in her reporting. She was very humble in her title as Shireen Abu Akleh. So in my opinion, that adds something to her legacy.
Thank you so much. Yeah, if we want to drop
sorry.
No.
Shall we move to the second question because of time? Yes, changing the way we think about Palestine. Of course, I mean, this is a great question because of the media, that there's a distortion and a misconception about Palestine. It's interesting that little things, for example, when it is reported the West Bank and Jerusalem is part of the West Bank, and Ilan talked about language. Language is important. This is one of the steps that we have to be aware of. What to say, how to the concepts, how to refer to Palestine, because Israel is trying to divide it, categorize people of the West Bank, Palestinians of the West Bank, Palestinians of Jerusalem, Palestinians of Gaza, Palestinians of the diaspora. I mean, these are examples, so we have to be very careful and aware of these concepts and how to refer to Palestine. And I think Ilan mentioned that before. Maybe Ilan wants to add to this as well. When, Ilan?
Yes, thank you. And I think you're absolutely sorry. Can you hear me?
Aywa.
Yeah.
Yes.
You
Yes.
can hear me? Yeah. Okay. Yes, I won't. I fully agree. I saw that in the chat there was a question from uh, someone from Italy, I think called Abir, that in school, if he mentioned in Italy the Palestinian side of the story, he would be immediately silenced as telling lies and so on. It doesn't start in schools, unfortunately. But you know, I came a few days ago from Italy, and there's a change in the way Italian academics are talking of Palestine in a way we never heard before. So we should understand that outside of Palestine, maybe not yet in France or in Germany, people are using a different language, and this will continue. And I think it will also happen in Germany and in France. It would be impossible to prevent from intelligent people who know where and impose on them to use a language of lies when they talk about Palestine. So I think that we know what to do, at least in this respect, in universities, in our interaction with our politicians, our media, and we should continue this. And I think we should remember, as Nadia and Lina said, people on the ground also need this kind of support because they are daily struggling and continue to struggle without giving up on it. I saw Shireen, I think it was the day before before she was assassinated. We were both in something called Masirat al-Nakba. This is an annual pilgrimage of Palestinians inside Israel, the 48 Arabs, into one of the villages Israel destroyed in 1948. I think that was her last report in many ways before Jenin. And I asked Shireen, because we were walking together in the procession, I asked her, why do you think it's so important for you to broadcast this procession of Palestinians inside Israel to a destroyed village to Al Jazeera, to the Arab world? And she said something very important. She said to me, you know, people in the Arab world, sometimes she says even Palestinians in the West Bank are not aware that the 1.5 million Palestinians inside Israel are also part of the struggle, are also part of the liberation. And this is a very clear indication for that liberation. So she thought, and that she saw it as part of her job to bring together these Palestinians' efforts that Israel is trying to fragment, to disunite, to show that it will never end and it will continue, whether you are a Palestinian citizen in Haifa, whether you live in Jerusalem or Ramallah, in a Hilwe camp, or in diasporic communities in England, Italy, or the United States. The Israelis have not succeeded in killing the Palestinian liberation movement, even if they took all over of Palestine and kicked out by force half of the Palestinian population and still doing this. So this is something that also should give us, and I think gave Shireen a sense that there's something still to fight for and not to despair, and believing that this connection between reporting, knowing, action, and liberation, as in so many cases of anti-colonialist struggles in the past, one day can be successful, and a different future can await for all of us.
Yeah, and actually one more thing that I mentioned at the beginning, which when I discussed with Shireen the latest EU report on Palestinian textbooks. So also there is an effort, not only from Israel, but also from the European and the US, I mean, from the international community, to reconstruct Palestinian narrative, forcing them to change their textbooks and not to narrate their own narrative. And this is, due to conditional funding and so on. So this campaign is ongoing to undermine Palestinian narrative and distort the whole cause, the whole truth if you like. And this started, by the way, of course, under military occupation in 1967, but it was intensified after Oslo Agreement within the neoliberal context and conditional funding.
And to add to that also, I mean, we touched a little base on it, is that the complicity of the Western media in spreading disunity, spreading disinformation, and the way they always continue to disregard the Palestinian narrative. They continue to disregard Palestinian eyewitnesses, for example, and they use the Israeli narrative to spread more often. And we saw this happen with the way they covered Shireen's funeral, the way they covered Shireen's assassination and all the events following that. And that just goes on to say is that we need to not only, we need to also continue to work on how the media portrays Palestinians and how the media uses the terms. I mean, using clashes, for example, I feel that's the only term they have in the Western media. That's the only term they have in their dictionary. Clashes. These things impact the Palestinian narrative, and it needs to be constantly talked about and criticized.
Yeah, I think this is, I mean, absolutely crucial. Like also talking to my family in Italy, there was this kind of huge mismatch between reality and what they heard. No, I mean, even after some days, even now that CNN report is out, they're saying, yeah, but still it's unclear on who killed her. No, which is not absolutely. But this is the quality of discourse that we have in the West, and this is where we should start. On this note, also, Musna is adding in the comments that we also need to educate and change the education system. Everything stops at Holocaust and the creation of Israel. There's no reference to the Nakba and the subsequent ethnic cleansing. Also, there's Theresa Messon that's saying that she wished that Shireen's story and that of Palestine was in mainstream media, and she would wish more people to be interested and wanted to see a change. And she's also ending saying that her MP, Elizabeth Truss, she's supporting and defending Israeli policies. I'm checking if there are other questions. It doesn't look like so. So if there's nothing to add, I would wrap up, and I would thank deeply our speakers, Nadia, Lina, and Ilan, for their perspective, for their commitment to this moment, and I'm also happy to have seen all this engagement from our public. We know that Shireen's story was also a personal one, not only a generic one, and this adds another important layer. So I hope this will be the opportunity for many of us to keep on engaging with what's happening in Palestine, with the continuous dispossession and the continuous crimes that go on unspoken. So I want to thank everyone again for participating. We will stay connected. As European Center of Palestine Studies, we always try to promote discussions. So follow our socials. We are on Twitter. We have a web page. There you can find all the information to keep connected and engage in the discussions. One of our mandates, a fundamental one, is to engaging, it's to being a bridge between academic discussion and the wider public. So we'll be more than happy to see you. So we'll close this session here. Thank you, everyone. I will close the recording. Thank you so much, and have a good evening.